Sorry.
So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to start out just talking about a little story about why I got interested in the brain and neuroscience. And it really started when I was a little girl. I was 5 years old. I remember looking up at the stars and the vastness of the night sky, and then I came to the realization that I'm going to die one day. And I mean, that freaked me out. So I thought, well, even if I don't have a body, could I still have my own inner thoughts? Could I still have my consciousness, right? Because that's what really mattered to me. So the next day I went and I asked my father, where do my thoughts come from? And he said, they come from your brain. I was like, great, how? Because I want to figure out how to keep them when I die. And he said, I don't know. And I was like, well, what can I be when I grow up to figure that out? He's like, I don't know, I guess a psychiatrist. But that then became my mission, to understand how this 3-pound piece of matter inside of our skulls can create our subjective experience, everything we feel and think, experience. But it's a complex piece of matter, right? So it's made up of about 100 billion neurons, each one that has about 1,000 to 10,000 connections or synapses. So there are more connections in the human brain than there are stars in the Milky Way. It's a really complex piece of matter. And we think of it kind of like an information processing machine, right? But it's a myth we only use 10% of our brain. We use all of our brain, right? None of it is redundant. We're probably just only conscious of about a small percentage of the brain. Most of what's happening inside the brain is happening unconsciously, outside of awareness. It's dictating the decisions we make. We often come up with sort of post hoc explanations about why we do things, but they're stories we tell ourselves. Most of it is really happening outside of awareness. So this became really fascinating to me. What is the neural basis of these unconscious processes that are really motivating our behavior? And we can study this in the lab by giving people either very subtle stimuli or things that are presented very quickly where they don't consciously experience it, but then it goes on to affect their behavior. So here's an example of a subliminal stimuli that we'll use in the lab. So raise your hand if you see the subliminal message. One per two, couple people. Oh, sorry. Yes. Okay, if you don't see it, and I know what you guys are thinking, you saw it right away. In the sort of right down here by the, you can't really see this, but by the roots it says SEX in the negative space. Can you see? And there's sort of birds and the bees and the flowers are kind of loving toward each other, right? Now, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Something changed in your brain. If I show you this 5 hours from now, you're just going to see the word sex. That's it. So, but what's interesting here is that the photons hitting your retina being processed by your visual cortex, the physical stimuli remains exactly the same. But what changes is your perception in your mind's eye. And that's what we want to track. What's the neural basis of your conscious perception? What changes in your mind when you see it versus when you don't, when the stimuli is exactly the same? And this information, though, even before you consciously saw it, it gets into your brain. Your brain is processing it, and it affects your behavior. We can't be conscious of everything our brain is taking in all the time. It would be overwhelming. So it's very adaptive for us not to be conscious of what's getting in, and only to be very selective of what we're conscious of. But this information goes in and affects our behavior. So this is actually a Parents Magazine issue that went to press. If you see this, nobody picked up. I don't know what kind of message it was sending. Here's another example of a subliminal. So raise your hand. Do you guys all see the subliminal? Great. Okay, you all see the 9 dolphins in the negative space. That's what you guys. Is that what you saw? Well, what's really interesting here is that when you show this to children, they're more likely to just see the 9 dolphins, because what we perceive is context dependent. It's experience dependent. Our brain creates our perception, and it's a combination between what stimuli is coming in and what past experience we have and what our expectations are, so coming from within. And where these two things meet is where our brain creates our reality. But it's not a one-to-one correlation. And we can be manipulated all the time, especially when there's ambiguous stimulation. So I'm going to play you a sound now. And then I want you to there's going to be a word up on the upper right or the left, and you're going to choose just one of those two to look at and listen to the sound and see what you hear. Then I'm going to play it again, and I want you to look at the opposite word, okay? So pick a word. Now do it again, listen. Did you hear something different each time, right? Depending on, listen to. Right, and then hear it again. Right, so your brain is, again, creating a reality, and you're very suggestible, right, to what the context is whenever there's ambiguous stimulation. I'm going to give you just one more example to show you this. We all know this song, right? If there's a bustle in your head, don't be alone. I kind of want to keep playing it, but we don't have a lot of time. So, okay, you know this song, but now you remember the whole thing with, like, if you play it backwards, there's like satanic messages. So I'm going to play it backwards for you now. I want you to listen, see if you hear any of those subliminal messages, okay? Did you hear it? Anybody? No, nothing? Okay, now I want you to listen to it again, but read the text at the same time. Okay, ready? Right? Suddenly, our brain is constructing this whole new reality, right? And so that's what I mean by, we're taking these cues from the environment and creating our own perception. Everyone sees the world in a slightly different way. But the point here is that what we perceive is not a one-to-one correlation with what's actually out there. It's a creation of our brain. It's like creating a movie script in real time. Here's just another perceptual example. You see squares A and B, they look like they're different shades of gray, but I can assure you they're physically exactly the same shade of gray. And this is a sort of effect because, like, the squares around B are darker and there's a shadow on it, so our brain kind of lightens it up. And A, it darkens up. It's similar to this dress phenomena, right? And so you can see it better here when I take away the shadow. Remember, people saw this middle dress here, and some people saw it as blue and black and white and gold. And again, that's because some people interpret it as more blue light hitting it or more sort of lighter yellow light, and we make this calculation, and our brain literally sees it in different ways, depending on how it interprets it. And so we can give people these stimuli in the lab. For example, this, where it's a bistable image. You can either see it as an old woman looking down or a young woman looking away. But the physical stimuli is exactly the same. But what we want to track is, okay, what's happening in your brain, for example, when you see the older woman versus the younger one? And whatever you perceive in any given moment is correlated with these coalitions of neurons that start firing together. So you can think of it like a sort of Darwinian competition between groups of neurons in your brain. So when a couple of them come into power, that's what you perceive. It can last for a few seconds. If you attend to something, it lasts a little longer until the next sort of coalition of neurons comes into power. And that's the ebb and flow of our conscious experience. But this is actually a Twitter feed. And if you think about it, like, it's similar to that. If each neuron firing is like a tweet, when enough people start tweeting about something, it starts to trend, right, in our sort of global consciousness. That's what's happening in the brain. It's happening across these distributed networks. It's not like it's all coming together in one place. This is just a neural network of a bird brain. Most of us have more complex brains than a bird brain, so you can imagine how complex it is to track these neurons that are coming together, because they're not all coming together in one place. And also, it's not like they're all firing at the same time. That would be like an epileptic seizure. They're firing in coordination, in sync. Think about sort of musicians in an orchestra playing. They're not all playing the same note, but they're not playing randomly. They're playing in coordination, or like a wave moving through a crowd. Each person's like a neuron. They're not all standing up, sitting down at the same time, but this in sync. And so one theory of the neural basis of consciousness, there's a couple of theories. We haven't settled on. There's a huge project right now, actually, that I'm involved in, that internationally we're looking at if we can experimentally test out all these different theories of consciousness. But the main contenders are one called sort of fame in the brain theory. And basically, this is here, for example, you can either see like a face come through or a house occasionally. But sometimes there's faces and houses that are, you don't see, but they're there. And it's kind of like when the word sex, before you saw it, it activates the back part of your brain, the primary visual cortex. This is a lateral side view. but only when the activation starts spreading to the prefrontal cortex and you get these sort of feedback loops to the back of the brain, that's when it comes into consciousness. So even when it's activating just the primary visual cortex, you're not consciously aware of it, but again, it can affect your behavior. But when it catches on, this sort of catching on, like fame in the brain, we call it, this is one theory. And it's also, the technical term is the global neuronal workspace theory of consciousness, but just fame in the brain. And the other sort of prominent theory is called the integrated information theory of consciousness. And this basically, and this is what Giulio Tononi is the scientist who sort of was the proponent of this theory, that any system that has a high degree of integrated, differentiated information has the property of consciousness. By integrated, I mean like if a pixel on your phone goes out, it doesn't affect the one next to it. But if a neuron fires, it affects the one next to it. That's integration of information. It's a bit of information. And like gravity is a property of the universe, the idea is consciousness will emerge out of any system. The brain just happens to be one of those systems. So it's kind of a panpsychic view. Now, my last little bit, just as my primer on the brain, is that you can think of the brain of having these two basic systems, right? You have these subcortical limbic system, which is your, sort of like your reptilian brain, your evolutionary older parts of your brain, sensitive to immediate pleasure and avoidance of pain. It's your hedonistic id impulses. I think of it like the Keith Richards of the brain, right? Limbic. It's like all like, yeah, let's party. And then you have the more recently evolved prefrontal cortex. Actually, humans have the largest percentage of prefrontal cortex compared to the rest of the brain than any other animal. And that's like kind of, we call it the executor of the brain, the executive function. It's involved in planning, decision-making, self-control, thinking about the future consequences of your actions. So I think of it as like the Spock of your brain, right? And I debated whether the limbic system should be Captain Kirk or not, but I was like, I don't think he's impulsive enough. I mean, he has like sexual promiscuity and stuff, but anyway, this is my matchup here. And when these two systems are in sync and we make adaptive decisions, right? You know, I want that chocolate cake now, but maybe I want to look good in that bikini, so I'm not. And you know, but when there's too much overactivation of the limbic system, so like think about it, the sort of accelerator can override the brake system, then we make impulsive choices. Or if the brake system is broken, the prefrontal cortex has damage or it's underactive, then again, we make these impulsive choices, or if there's problems with the connectivity between these two systems. So I don't know, this was for fun, but I made an AI generated image. I was like, give me an image of the prefrontal cortex like fighting the id, and this is what it gave me. So the limbic system, I thought it was pretty cool. So I'm gonna give you guys just all a test so you can feel what self-control feels like just a little bit. So as this example, what I want you to do is I want you to read the word that I want you to read the color of the ink of the words all at the same time. Okay, ready? So let's go. What's going on, guys? I don't know. You have to come see me after. But did you feel that like dissonance there, that conflict, right? So your instinct is I just want to like read the word, but you had to like suppress that. That takes energy. That takes prefrontal cortex control to be able to read the ink because there was a difference there. And we know that when people, even just when we show people videos of violence versus a video of a nature scene, seeing violence, actually, they get decreased activation in the prefrontal cortex. It decreases your inhibition. And of course, the classic case of Phineas Gage, which most people heard in like Psych 101, but you know, he was working on a railroad. There was a spark and this tamping iron rod went straight through his prefrontal cortex. The interesting thing here is that, and this was sort of the foundation of the idea that the prefrontal cortex is involved in impulse control. But his language remained intact, his intelligence remained intact. What changed was his personality. And he became more sort of like using profanity and had less impulse control. And there's also this kind of modern day Phineas Gage case where this was a man, he was in his 40s and suddenly he started developing sort of pedophilia-like symptoms, which is sort of rare to develop that late in life. And he was living with a young stepdaughter. They said they had removed him from the home. They were going to put him in jail. And he started getting these really severe headaches. They did neuroimaging and they found he had this huge tumor in his prefrontal cortex, his orbital prefrontal cortex. They removed the tumor and the symptoms went away. He was allowed to return home. Everything was fine. And about a year later, the symptoms started returning and sure enough, the tumor had returned. And this is a really interesting case because it gets away from just correlation, like what lights up in the scanner, to causation, right? Changes in the brain actually changing our behavior and our personality. Now, in terms of this prefrontal cortex or impulse control, it's a spectrum, right? We're all on a spectrum of too much, either we can have over control or under control. Some people are just right. But people who have too little activation of the prefrontal cortex, you can get these psychiatric illnesses like antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, pathological gambling. But too much over control of the prefrontal cortex, and you can have other problems. You get too restrictive, obsessive compulsive disorder, anorexia, right? So the treatment isn't the same for everyone. Some people need treatment to help them turn their prefrontal cortex up and gain more control. Others need help with letting go and turning it down, right? Because the overactivation also is the rumination and anxiety and things like that. But as I was saying, most of what's happening is, again, happening in these subcortical areas. And this was a really interesting experiment just looking at subliminal motivation. So this was done in the UK. They showed people either a picture of a pound or a penny, pound being more than the penny, and they had to squeeze a grip. And the harder they squeezed, the more the money they could win. So sure enough, when they saw the pound, they would squeeze harder than when they saw the penny. They were more motivated. But they would present this image at either 1750 or 100 milliseconds. And they could only consciously see it at 100 milliseconds. But even when it was presented subliminally, they were told, just squeeze the thing anyway, which they did. And they found they would squeeze harder for the subliminally presented pound than the penny as well. And when you looked at what was happening in the brain, they were in the scanner, fMRI, which basically looks at blood flow to different parts of the brain, which is a proxy to neurons being activated. They found that what happens is when the subliminally presented money activates these subcortical areas, motivates you. And only after the fact do you get activation of the prefrontal cortex, the more conscious control. So we're being motivated a lot of times. There's subliminal motivation happening all the time. And the decisions we make, I want to say, is that what studies have found is that when you have big decisions to make, like, should I take this job? Should I move to this place? Should I marry this person? You don't have the best, what we call post-decisional satisfaction by making a conscious list. Okay, let me list, like, should I marry this person? All the positives and all the negatives. Okay, and if the positives outweigh the negatives, then I'll marry them. And that's not how we do it, right? When there's many variables, so the consciousness is good at certain things, but it has a limited capacity. The unconscious is unlimited. We don't know the limits. So when it comes to things that involve many variables, it makes sense to take it all in consciously and then let the unconscious do its work. And then that's when people talk about a gut feeling, go with your gut or just sleep on it, whatever. Because the conscious and unconscious can process much more in terms of variables and take a lot of things into account that consciousness is very limited. However, when it's a small decision, like which oven mitt should I buy, they found that actually consciousness, you make better decisions because you can have limited factor. Okay, I only want to go at this price point. I only want this kind of color. And so they did this test using something called deliberation without attention. You could take in all the variables consciously, then either you're allowed to think of it or you had to do some distracting task. So the point is, if you have a big decision, study hard about it, crowdsource, ask people, do whatever you need to do, and then let it go. And then you trust your gut, which is your unconscious. Most decisions, like I said, are involving emotions. This idea that, like, if we can make Spock-like decisions, that's actually not the best way to make decisions. Emotions inform our decisions, and that's important. We make better decisions that are informed by our emotions. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about, how much control do we really have? Some studies, and this is controversial, about our willpower, right? How much control do we have over our decisions if much of it's being promoted as being sort of stimulated by these unconscious processes? But we do have some control to sort of override our innate instincts. But some studies show that the more control you have in other circumstances, it can wear itself out. And there's this great, interesting study. We think judges are so, rational and they make all these rational decisions. This really interesting study showed that they were making decisions about parole. And the default is to not let prisoners out, right? It's just easier to just, you'd have to sort of override the status quo to decide to let them out on parole. And they found that in the morning, the judges made decisions that I think they let them out, 65% of the time, they would let them out in parole starting in the morning. Then as the day went on, that would gradually go down, down, down until just before lunch when it was 0. They would go to lunch, they'd come back, it goes up to 65% again. So, everyone, we're all humans, we're all impacted by this. And that does lead the question of how much control do we really have, right? What is free will? And this is a whole larger discussion, which I could do a whole lecture on, but I'm just going to touch very briefly on it to say that when we talk about free will in terms of the Cartesian sense of free will, is that if everything in the environment was exactly the same and everything in your brain was exactly the same, you could have done otherwise, which would mean that there has to be some sort of ghost in the machine, right? Something else happening outside of the physical brain, sort of your neurons firing. And according to neuroscience, we don't see any evidence for that. And this was a classic study that was done in the 1980s by Benjamin Libet. He looked at brain activation in the primary visual cortex. He said, like, just press a button to advance a slide whenever you feel like it. And just let me know where that little ball is on that clock the moment you get the intention to move. Not even when you move, because that actually takes time. So that's called the W, is the awareness of your even intention. Then it takes about 200 milliseconds to even actually engage in the action. But when he looked at brain activation, you can see before you even have the conscious intention to make the movement, you get this built up of brain activation. So it's almost like the brain is deciding, and then you get this feeling after of like, oh, I intend to do this thing. And don't get wrong, that intention, the feeling of having free will is very important. Because when you tell people they don't have free will, they're more likely to cheat on exams, they're more likely to act differently. So we've evolved this sort of subjective feeling for a reason, because we're social creatures. Now, people didn't like this. Obviously, this doesn't, people were fighting against it. And so they said, what about free won't? What about when you have that intention to move, but before you actually move, you can stop it, right? But then there were studies that showed that even that the decision to inhibit a response has these brain precursors in it. So we really can't get out of this. But I often say, like, our unconscious might have free will, right? It might be making its own decisions, but, we're sort of the last to know about it. And kind of the final thing I want to just say about, in terms of, our neuroanatomy and our brain, is that the prefrontal cortex isn't really fully evolved, isn't fully developed until in our mid-20s, right? So that's why, some people are like, well, if I don't have free will, can I just like kill someone and say my brain made me do it? Like, no, but we have the capacity to have self-control, and we hold people accountable for their actions to the extent that they have the capacity to have this control. And so, that's why a child commits a crime, they are held less responsible than an adult that has a fully formed brake system, fully formed prefrontal cortex. And of course, there are individual differences in terms of impulse control. This famous marshmallow test, which is a bit controversial, but they said to these kids, 4 to 6, you can either have 1 marshmallow now, or you could wait and have 2 later. And then they just leave the 1 marshmallow, walk out of the room, and they would, some would just struggle and they can't take it and they'd eat it. And others could withstand waiting. But this, of all the measures, correlated most with later future success in life, with job attainment, marital status, body mass index, all of it. But really, it's just a measure of prefrontal cortex function, right? How much control you have scales up throughout life, right? If you're in college and you're like, should I go to the party tonight or stay home and study, right? The more control you have, it leads to better future outcomes. And so we're always trying to think about how can people come up with better ways to have more impulse control, to turn on the prefrontal cortex. And, because it's an opportunity, especially for children, and there are ways you can do it. You can get people to stop and think before just automatically responding. You could try to know what your predilections are. Okay, I know I have a sweet tooth, so I'm not gonna, structure your environment accordingly. Don't have sweets in the house, make it more difficult to get. There are a lot of ways we can help sort of bolster our impulse control and increase activation of the prefrontal cortex. That being said, I think that it's also important to be able to let go and to be able to turn down the prefrontal cortex at will. This is associated, like children, they're much more playful. They're much more creative. They haven't built in those restrictions yet. And there's advantages to being able to let go in a controlled way, to be able to decrease that prefrontal cortex. If it was decreased all the time, again, you'd be impulsive and that wouldn't be good. But to find ways to turn it down can be associated with really positive emotions. And it can also allow us to access these unconscious processes, because there's other studies that show when the prefrontal cortex, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is turned up, it then suppresses these subcortical areas like the amygdala involved in emotion, the hippocampus involved in memories. It can suppress unwanted memories or emotions, which can be adaptive in some ways, but it can come out in other ways, right? Freud had some of this right, where you have anxiety, it's suppressed, and it comes out in other ways. So one way to sort of help resolve these unconscious things is allow them to come to the surface, say with a therapist, and reintegrate them into the brain in a new way so they're not constantly running in a program in the background causing you to be, say, anxious, for example. So one way to get deactivation of the prefrontal cortex that I found is actually through creativity. And it started with this interesting study. This was done with people who freestyle rappers. So this is where you spontaneously come up with a rap. It has to rhyme. It needs to make sense. It's kind of like Freud's free association. You don't have time to think, or it has to stay on the rhythm. So a lot of it is you have to get into a flow state. It's sort of an access. Again, these things are bubbling up from the unconscious. You don't have enough time to filter it. And this one study, they looked at rappers and they had them do a memorized rap in the fMRI and then a freestyle rap and looked at the difference in brain activation between the two conditions and found that when they were freestyling, there was a unique pattern of brain activation where they had decreased activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the areas in blue, which this is the part of the brain that has to do with, again, control, self-control, also our sense of self. And so a lot of people in their flow state, it feels like it's coming through me, it's coming from somewhere else because your sense of self and agency is turned down. It also has to do with conforming our behavior to make sure it fits in with social norms. But in these states, it's like anything goes. And that allows for creativity because you're unrestricted. And it also allows for novel associations between ideas. I mean, I think that's really what creativity is. It's everybody has access to the same information, but some people put it together in these novel ways that nobody else has thought of. I mean, think of even like Darwin, right? Everyone had access to all the data points he had access to, but he put together all that data in a unique way to come up with this theory of evolution. So when you take the filter off, in a controlled way, it can allow for you to open up both to access things from the unconscious and come up with novel associations between ideas. And you see also these areas in red or like sort of yellow and orange, that's the increased activation of the medial prefrontal cortex. So that has to do with the self-generation of ideas. So you have sort of the new ideas are coming up from the unconscious, the filter system is turned down, the sense of self is turned down, and you're in these flow states. The minute you become too self-aware, self-conscious, you're turning back on that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and you lose the flow. So with anything, like giving a talk, if I'm like, oh my God, how do I sound? What are they thinking? Whatever. Then I'm out of the flow of it. Or if you're playing a game of tennis, you're like, what angle exactly should I hit the ball? You're losing that flow. So sometimes you really want to let the unconscious just do its work. You want to train it first. So a freestyle rapper isn't just saying random words, but you want to take in all the information. Or for example, this is a jazz improviser. So they had a jazz musician in the scanner and they did a memorized piece and then an improvised piece. And they had a similar pattern of brain activation, decreased activation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, increased activation of the medial prefrontal cortex. And again, they're not just playing random notes when they're freestyling. It's within the constraints of certain rules of how to play music, but there is an element of just letting go and letting what they already know, what they've been trained to do. The best improvisers are people who've done all the training consciously and then are able to let go and let their unconscious do the work. And I'm just going to quote this philosopher, Marshall Mathers, aka Eminem, right? You got to lose yourself in the music, the moment you own it, you better never let it go. Do you guys all know Eminem? I don't know what kind of crowd this is, but rapping neuroscientist. But when people are in this state, this flow state, it's associated with sort of a lack of focus, letting go focus, very positive emotions. Right? It's hard to be anxious when you're in this flow state because the part of the brain, as I talked about before, that has to do with rumination and anxiety, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is turned up when you're ruminating and you're anxious. And so when you're in the flow state, it forces it to turn it down. So you tend to feel better, right? You lose your sense of self and place and time. If you've ever, I call it the sort of cold tea test. So like if you make a hot cup of tea, you get to your desk, you're working on something, you're so into it, you go back to your tea, it's like cold. You forgot about it, right? And so you're kind of lost and time passes very quickly when you're in these states. And the question that I have is, could we, this sort of neural signature of creativity, of spontaneous creativity, right? Because there's different types of creativity. Like sometimes, if you're writing a book, and, maybe the initial thing is I'm going to write whatever and it's all going to flow. Then you go back and you have to consciously edit and do things. But when you're in that moment of spontaneous creativity, there seems to be this pattern of brain activations, neural signature. And so, I'm interested in, does it cut across different art forms, right? What about painting? What about theater improv, comedy improv, dance improv? Is it all the same when we look at the flow state regardless? Or, when you're playing a game of tennis? And it's not just during creativity we see this pattern of brain activation. It's during it's during hypnosis, certain types of meditation, during daydreaming. It's healthy to daydream, just let your mind go. And during REM sleep, when the prefrontal cortex is turned down, and so anything goes, right? Your dreams are often weird and, sort of trippy, right? It doesn't make sense, but you kind of then, when you wake up, you kind of try to put it all together and make meaning out of it. Because our brains are like meaning maker machines. They're trying to make sense of random stimuli and gives us a sense of feeling of control over our environment. And sleep is actually associated with creativity. So this one study, they gave people a riddle and they said, there's a novel way to solve this. And for half the people, they kept them awake. They didn't sleep for 8 hours and they could think about the solution or not, do whatever they wanted really. And the other half, they were allowed to sleep. And then they asked them the next day, could you solve this? And the people who were able to sleep, who were allowed to sleep, 60% of them were able to solve the riddle with this novel solution. And the people who didn't sleep, only 23% of them could solve it. And so we know that when you sleep, it's an active process. You're actually taking the information that you've taken in during the day is consolidating, and it allows for certain insights. So sleep is really important. And even just naps, a short nap can increase your productivity, your creativity. And these great thinkers like, I think it was Einstein and did this and Dali, they had this sort of like spoon thing that they were like, so you hold a spoon or a pencil and you like allow yourself to fall asleep and kind of take like a micro nap. And then, but as soon as you fall asleep enough, the spoon drops and wakes you up. But just having that short micro nap, they would come up with these new ideas, right? So there's something really special going on during sleep. And what's also interesting is we see a similar pattern of brain activation of this decreased prefrontal cortex activation. You could see it here during certain types of meditation, and here in blue with psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in psychedelic mushrooms, that you get decreased activation in certain parts of the prefrontal cortex, which allows for novel associations between ideas, right? Again, you wouldn't want to be in this state all the time, right? That would be like sort of a schizophrenic. Schizophrenics are in this state where everything is unfiltered and it's almost too much information, stimuli is coming at you, and you're not able to sort of put it together in a very logical way, because filtering is important. Just like memory, if you had to remember everything you ever came across, that'd be overwhelming. It's too much. It's adaptive to forget, right? So this is just a schematic of the brain. This is basically looking at connections in the brain. So you have the darker lines are stronger connections, and the distance, like the ones that are closer together, are closer connections, and these are farther apart. So it's this schematic of the neural network. And this is what it looks like with people who are in placebo, took a placebo in this one study. And this is what it looks like on psilocybin. So it's this like unconstrained, unfiltered, you get freer communication pathways. It's a wider repertoire of possible brain states. And there's just higher like signal diversity. And when you're in this state, again, you lose your sense of self. You feel more connected with either a higher power or with other people, but the boundary between self and others starts to dissolve. And so again, you don't need drugs to get into this state. This is just like a real like fast track to get there, but you can get there in these non-drug ways as well, like through these flow states and creativity and meditation. But it's just very interesting that they all have this in common in terms of what it looks like at the neural level. And now we're starting to use these drugs, these psychedelics, to treat psychiatric patients, and it's called psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Different drugs for different things. So ketamine it's not quite a psychedelic, but it's sort of, they put it in this category for the treatment of depression and anxiety. Psilocybin also to treat these disorders. And we're finding that it's having this profound and lasting effect. So people who have been depressed or anxious and nothing else works. Now, the normal line of treatment is, say, like SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, with, the Prozac and Lexapro and those kinds of things. But you have to take it every day. The second it's out of your system, the symptoms will come back, right? You always need to have the medication in the system. What's interesting with the psychedelic psychotherapy, MDMA also is another one, like ecstasy for PTSD, is that you can do just a couple of sessions of it, and then the positive effects last. And we're starting to try to understand why that is. We think, when they're in this state, it increases neuroplasticity, and so the brain becomes more malleable. Even though the brain is malleable throughout life, it sort of helps you be more open to suggestion, but you do it together with therapy. It's not like, oh, I'm just gonna go to the club and do drugs and I'm gonna cure my depression. It's a process of almost like the therapist is like the sculptor, and the drug was helping you get the clay more malleable. And then, you work with the therapist to help, get to a better place. But fundamentally, it changes people's perspective. And as I was saying earlier, we all see the world through different, when you're depressed, you see the world through depression-colored glasses, right? Two people can see the same thing, and one be like, oh, see all the negative things, half glass empty, half full kind of thing. But this can change your perspective fundamentally, and I liken it to this sort of overview effect as well. Like astronauts, we're going to hear from Katie Coleman, an awesome astronaut, right after my talk, who see, Earth from space for the first time, and they start fundamentally changes our perspective or their perspective. And that when you see things in a new way, it can have a lasting effect. So it's similar to the astronauts call this the overview effect. But again, being able to decrease or dissolve our sort of ego allows us to feel connected to whether it's a higher power, other people, and less alone. And a lot of the symptoms of depression are people who feel lonely. So for the final just part of my talk, I just want to give a little taste of kind of where we're going in terms of the future of the brain. And a big thing that's in development now is our neural implants. So, the more we understand about how the brain works, the better we're able to kind of go in and start to directly manipulate it and change ourselves basically with the press of a button. And one of the things that, I've been working on as well is something called deep brain stimulation, where we basically implant electrodes to subcortical parts of the brain, those deeper limbic system areas, to treat, which started, so basically it's a little stimulator, it's minimally invasive surgery. We just 2 little burr holes in the skull and then just slip the wire straight in. No big deal. But what's really interesting is that what's the most interesting is that you only have to just numb the scalp because there's, pain sensors there. But the brain itself, even though it's the center of our pain, doesn't feel anything, right? So we actually wake up people during surgery and talk to them and test out the electrodes. There's no anesthetic in the brain. You don't feel anything in there. It's really, it's interesting. But anyway, it's connected to this battery pack that it's connected to, implanted in the chest. The same company that makes pacemakers basically makes this. And then we can control it with remote control, the amount of stimulation. This is what the electrode looks like. There's 4 different contact points. This is what it looks like implanted. And we've been doing this, that started out to treat movement disorder. So it's been being used for years now, and now it's moving into the realm of treating psychiatric illnesses like intractable or untreatable OCD or depression, where they've tried everything, nothing works, and this is kind of a last resort. But it was first started for things like Parkinson's disease. I'm going to show you a patient who had the implants turned on for the first time, a Parkinson's patient, so you can see how immediate these effects are.
Okay, so we're here for the initial programming session. You got both sides of the brain put in, bilateral stimulators, and we're here for the initial programming session. This is what it looks like without the medicine and the stimulator. And now we're just going to turn it on. If I can get my fat fingers to hit the button. There we go. See how that feels. How you feel?
A lot better.
Yeah. Excellent. Try tapping both your fingers for me. Excellent. All right. Feels pretty good?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good.
It's pretty profound. It's pretty amazing when you see this. And now what we can see with the treatment of psychiatric illnesses, about 40 to 50% of people with, again, untreatable depression and about 60 to 70% of people with untreatable OCD have significant improvement. They're able to go out and live their lives again. And we've seen this now, the long-term studies, it has a long-term effect now it's out about 10 years. What's really interesting is that after about 4 or 5 years, the symptoms start coming back. And that's actually when the battery is running out and you got to go in and change the battery. But what's also interesting is, we've done some testing where you turn it off after, a number of years and the symptoms go right back up to where they were before you implanted them. So it's not really like changing anything in particular in the brain, and we still don't know exactly what's happening. And the implants, the target of where we put the implants are different depending on the disorder. But whether it's like blocking a faulty circuit or stimulating one that wasn't stimulated, there's still a lot of science that we're doing there. But it's not like these implants can work for everything. It really has to do with knowing the neurocircuitry. Like depression has a very clear neurocircuitry, so we implant them in a specific like node within that circuit. The same thing with OCD, but something like, let's say, autism, which involves just a lot of brain circuits. These stimulators, we wouldn't know where to implant them. There's no one place that's like sort of a hub. But these are things that are in development, and these are the different sort of areas in which to treat. You can treat for pain and movement disorders and for migraines, things like that. It's really interesting too, is that we used to go in and actually lesion the part of the brain, say for obsessive compulsive disorder. But once it's lesioned, you can't go back. It's not reversible. It's not adjustable. These implants are minimally invasive. If they don't work, you can just shut them off. There's no brain damage. And I just want to show you this one patient in the OR that as soon as we turn on the stimulators, you kind of test to see, if they're on. This patient doesn't know whether they're on or off. And this was her reaction when they were turned on.
Oh, man.
Describe what you're feeling right now.
I feel happy.
It's pretty amazing, right? So now, again, we're going from correlation to causation, right? Stimulating the brain directly to manipulate emotions. So be nice to neuroscientists, because we got our finger on the button. Just saying. But it's profound. And now it's not only stimulating, there's these brain-computer interfaces where this is a microelectrode array that you can implant in the brain that can record from activation that's happening in the brain. And you then can send these neural signals of brain activation to a computer, which can then translate that, for example, into moving a prosthetic limb. So now she's a quadriplegic who just could think about lifting up a cup of coffee and drinking it and could give herself a cup of coffee. And you can seamlessly now think about moving parts of your body, and you can control prosthetic limbs with just your thoughts. People who are quadriplegic who can't communicate can type out messages on a screen by moving a cursor, thinking about moving it and typing it out on a letterboard like this over here. This is a man who was wearing this, like a sort of Iron Man robotic suit, that he's controlling this movement by thinking about walking. And then walking with this, it's pretty amazing. And the electrodes are getting smaller and smaller. Elon Musk has this Neuralink company, but this is based on research that's been going on in neuroscience for quite some time. He's saying, okay, we're going to make these, they're so small, they're going to be mesh-like and seamlessly integrate into the brain. But there's some fundamental issues with actually biology that are missing in that. So I don't know how we're really going to get to that point. But the technology is evolving, and these implants we have now are basically primitive, like they're like walkie-talkies compared to cell phones, smartphones. And the more we understand about the brain, ultimately we'll be able to treat more disorders, but also it's going to move into the realm of cognitive enhancement, right? And so we can improve things like our processing speed, our decision-making ability, our memory capacity, even, modulate our emotions. And then, of course, there are ethical issues, right? Maybe we can increase our creativity, right? But it will be like performance-enhancing drugs, right? Like everybody has to have them or no one can have them, because it would give people such an advantage, right? Imagine like SAT scores, like those who have the implants versus those that don't. And what if somebody could hack into your neural implants and control your thoughts? And this is not like a far-fetched thing. We can do this in mice. We control the implants and we can control their behavior. We can make them go left and make them go right. We can make they're about to go to a high-fat pellet, and we can make them go to the low-fat one, like right when we see the right neural signature. So these bring up important, issues. And with these brain-computer interfaces, ultimately linking them with AI as well, can really accelerate this process. And we might have to even implant an AI immune system to sort of defend against external threats. This is things we're thinking about, but ultimately, what does this mean in terms of our identity and what it means to be human, right? Because our brains create our sense of self. So as we sort of become cyborgs and merge with technology, what does it mean to be human? And now imagine that one of your brain's, 100 billion neurons is replaced by a silicon chip that can do exactly the same thing, right? That can now, turn on or off, and you swap one of them and can do the same function. And then what about 2 and 3 and 4, right? And then if you scale this up, you have to think, at what point are you still you? At what point are you still conscious? And we don't know, right? We're going to need a sort of, these AI systems can pass the Turing test, which used to be the sort of test of how intelligent it is. And systems might say they're conscious, but are they really conscious? Ultimately, we need a fundamental theory of consciousness that we agree on that will let us know whether a bee is conscious, whether the fetus is conscious. I don't even know that you're conscious. I assume you are, but my consciousness is first-person subjective experience. I only know my own subjective experience and feeling. As of now, and to know whether an AI system has it, you can ask it. It might say, yeah, I'm conscious. But in order to know, we need a fundamental theory. Right now, there are only simulations. ChatGPT, they're simulations. It's like if I were to simulate a black hole in a computer, it's not going to suck you into the computer, right? It's just a simulation. If I simulate weather, it's not going to make your desktop wet, right? But maybe if we build a neuromorphic computer that has a physical substrate, that theory, the integrated information theory of consciousness, says you need a physical substrate that has a high degree of integrated differentiated information, maybe that neuromorphic computer will be conscious. But then the question is, what's left for humans? Is it creativity? Not really. Computers can do AI systems do a lot of creative things now. They can write books, they can make artwork, right? And perhaps it's wisdom. We still have consciousness, we have experiences, we have feelings. When you combine that with knowledge, that sort of equates to wisdom. So, the more I learn about the brain, the more I'm fascinated by it, the more we understand about it, the still understanding there's so much we don't know, right? How do these unconscious processes come up to consciousness? What's the neural basis of suppression and repression? How does psychotherapy work on the neural level? But what we can do with the information we have so far is we can try to look inward to understand our own unconscious processes, to bring your unconscious, into consciousness so you can live more in line with your future goals and be happier, know thyself. And, I started studying consciousness as a way to understand how, where my thoughts come from. And we still haven't found the answer to that. Maybe we never will, but, we've come much further along than anything that we knew when I was 5 years old. But I still have this feeling of awe that this 3-pound piece of matter could even ask these questions, right? So I just wanted to end on this picture in these really difficult times, because this was the first time, we saw Earth, this tiny blue dot from space. And this was the beginning of the environmental movement. It changed people's perspective. We're all in this together. And I love this photo because it's teamwork that got us there, scientific collaboration and discovery. And we need to, I think, continue to find these strategic ways in order to kind of inspire people to behave in the way that this photo makes us feel, like we're all in it together. We have a higher collective sort of destiny and purpose, and that all happens inside of our brain. Our brain defines who we are. It's a source of our ultimate triumphs, but also of our downfall. And I think by learning to understand how your brain works, to know yourself, it's the source of all your impulses, knowing when to control the impulses, when to set them free, and making your brain work for you is going to get us all to a better place, I think. And the brain is both, delicate and robust. It's easily damaged. It's impressively able to heal itself. And we're all, no matter how old you are, in this, it's always changing, right? It's always in an ongoing state, a process of self-discovery. And our brains are continually being shaped by our experiences. So and with some, sort of guided by our genetic code, but forming who we are. And so I really think we are all a work in progress until our very last breath. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.